recorded.
Well, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the third edition of the monthly roundtable by EURALO on the topic of Internet governance, Europe versus the rest of the world on Tuesday, the 16th of March, 2021. In the interest of time, we will not do a roll call, but all attendees' names will be noted on the wiki agenda page after today's meeting. We do have English, French, Spanish, and Russian interpretation on today's meeting. A kind reminder to please speak clearly to allow for accurate interpretation, and also please state your names every time you speak, not only for transcription purposes, but also for the interpreters to identify you on the other language channels. Thank you so much, and I will hand the call back over to Sébastien Bachollet, Chair of EURALO.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Can you go to the first slide, please? And, I wanted just to welcome you, and I am very happy that you are here, and I am also very happy that we have the interpretation in 4 different languages from English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And I hope that it will allow more people to participate and to understand the exchange and what is at stake. It's the third monthly roundtable that EURALO is organizing. The goal is to allow every people from different constituency part of ICANN to participate. It's not just done for EURALO members or participants. It's really open to worldwide. I just see Cheryl Longdenor joining us. Thank you very much, Cheryl. I know that the board members just tell me that they have already another meeting at the same time. That's a pity, but we will manage. And what's important is that we try to take some topics who are interesting from a point of view of Europe, but open to the world. And I am sure that it will be the case today. I want to thank you, Olivier, for organizing this roundtable, and I will give him the floor, and I will just come back at the end for some word of what next. But for now, it's Olivier who will run the show. Olivier, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. Olivier Crépin-Leblond speaking. And so welcome to this roundtable, which I'm really looking forward to, because it's got a bunch of really good panelists. First, the topic itself is really exciting. Digital Cacophony in a Splintering Cyberspace, a paper that Wolfgang Kleinwächter, Professor Emeritus at the University of Aarhus, wrote and published on Circle ID. And it's quite a provocative paper in that it basically shows that we're not enjoying a potential smooth sailing over the next few years. Already in 2019, things were tense. 2020, it became rough. And now there are a lot of issues out there on the table. So we will start with Professor Kleinwächter. Wolfgang will be able to take us through his paper and give us some insights as to the points that he really thinks need to be driven, not only, I guess, from a European perspective, but also, I guess this is a global perspective that we're looking at. But of course, we're in EURALO. And so we've got 3 other panelists that will then be commenting on what they've heard, what they've read. I gather everybody's read the paper. First, we have Fiona Alexander, who is from the American University. She is a distinguished fellow at the Internet Governance Lab at the American University. She used to work with Larry Strickling at the US Department of Commerce. So I guess she's quite aware of Internet governance topics on a big scale. Richard Hill used to work in the past for the ITU, now the president of the Association for Proper Internet Governance. Richard has been a critic of many of the Internet multi-stakeholder governance scenarios that many people have pushed for. So he's going to offer, I guess, a very different view, perhaps agree with some of the points that Wolfgang has made in his paper, but might also offer some counterpoints to what's being said there. And then Lucien Castex with the AFNIC, with the French .fr registry. Lucien has been active for many years now in the field of internet governance and certainly working with actors in the French internet landscape. One of the things that happened was there was an IGF that took place in Paris a couple of years ago, and President Macron addressed the audience in a lengthy speech, and many points that were developed by the President Macron have since echoed with some other governments in Europe. So Lucien knows much about this. I can't say that he's the guy that wrote the speech, but he was close to where things were happening. And I hope that he'll be able to share some insights also from not only a French perspective, but a European perspective. Of course, the big question here, and this is that of this session, you know, is there a difference between Europe and the rest of the world? We called it Europe versus the rest of the world. Is it against? Is it with? Well, we're going to find out first, I guess, from Wolfgang, who's going to enlighten us about some of this. And we'll then have the panelists speak. And after that, a Q&A session with everyone on the call. And I hope that we'll get a lot of input from people around who are attending on this call. You'll be able to ask questions or make comments in two different ways. You can either write them on the chat. So if it's a question, just put the question before that, and then we'll go through the questions in the chat. But you will also be able to intervene by using the wonderful capabilities of Zoom. If you look somewhere in there, there's a way for you to put your hand up, and we'll take the questions then or the comments as a cue that will appear on the screen. Hopefully technology will work. Right, we've got a good 90 or so minutes, maybe a little bit less than 90 minutes because of my rambling, but let's get going. So Wolfgang, I guess you're the first person, and yeah, it's all because of you. Digital Cacophony in the Splintering Cyberspace.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you, Sébastien, and all best wishes to EURALO. It's very nice, and I'm thankful that I have an opportunity to speak here. And as you know, I'm writing since around 10 years, every year, this Internet Governance Outlook for the Circle ID. And every year I have to challenge, you know, what would bring in one sentence the right message to the year ahead of us. And, you know, this year I said, okay, what we have now is not anymore this one world, one internet. So we have on the application layer now so many different voices. And we see on the ground layer also a number of efforts to splinter the internet. Some people have spoken about internet fragmentation, internet bifurcation, or whatsoever. So I see this as a challenge. And as Sébastien has and Olivier has said, we are moving into troubled waters. So it will be not a peaceful time in the years ahead. And we will have both. We have certainly some places, and this has to be figured out, where we can continue to stabilize the internet and to stabilize and enhance cooperation. But we will see also areas where we have more conflict and more confrontation. I think this is at least the summary and the message from the article, which was picked by Olivier to constitute the basis for our today's discussion. I'm not happy with the title of the workshop, which says Europe versus the rest of the world. So I would, if you read my article, then I say it's everybody against everybody. So the rest of the world is not united. Everybody of the big blocks has its own interest, is fighting for its own interest. And I think this is what has to be figured out in the years ahead of us. Are there areas for cooperation, and how we can get the conflicts where we have different interests and let's say, or different value systems, how we can get this under a certain control or manage the confrontation in a way that it does not lead into a digital disaster. But you know, this is EURALO and this is Europe. And so far, I will start with the European perspective. And what I have seen, I'm in this business for more than 30 years, is that with the new female tandem on the top of the European Union, we have seen quite a tremendous and interesting modification of the strategy. So while if you go back, we had commissioners like Madame Reding or Madame Cruz, which was calling for intergovernmental bodies as oversight for the for ICANN and for some others. I think this new team now, mainly von der Leyen and Madame Vestager, the Vice President of the European Commission, which is responsible for the whole digital issues, including some other commissioners, so which are part of this portfolio, so have developed a more comprehensive strategy, which has a number of interesting elements and which is now summarized under the slogan of the European Digital Decade. So never before Europe had a comprehensive strategy looking 10 years ahead of us and looking, you know, what are the key elements of it. And I think one of the key elements is certainly that Ursula von der Leyen, you know, repeats again and again and again that Europe invites the world, the rest of the world, to participate in writing the digital rule book. I think this language, the digital rule book, is now repeated by her again and again, and this makes rather clear that Europe's strengths, or where Europe sees its strengths, its role and responsibility, is to bring a certain order into the cyberspace without limiting the freedom. So that means the previous efforts, if you look into 25 or 2010, we had sometimes the impression that initiatives by the European Union are aimed to strengthen the role of the government and to introduce regulation, which would end up in limiting innovation or lead to certain types of censorship or protectionism and things like that. My understanding from the package, which is now on the table with the various acts, the Digital Market Act, the Digital Governance Act, the Data Governance Act, and other acts, the security strategy and the data strategy, the artificial intelligence strategy, is really, you know, that Europe becomes more active in becoming on its own a big player, but based on rules. And it's interesting to see what what Madame Vestager, when she introduced the package, she used the as a historical parallel, the introduction of traffic light in the US hundreds and more years ago, where they said, okay, on the information highway. So there were more and more and more vehicles, and free driving became risky without rules. And she said it was the introduction of a rule book for traffic and the introduction of traffic lights with red, green, and yellow was not aimed to reduce the freedom of travel or to stop innovation in the car industry. In contrary, so this has stimulated the development of the industry and has saved a lot of lives. So the security level was higher, and more or less people accepted that if you have reached a certain level, which you could call also a cacophony, so you need some guidelines, you need some rules. So I think this is a different approach, what is now taken by the European Union from what Mr. Macron introduced 3 years ago at the IGF, and he gave the big speech, which produced also a lot of controversy when he said Europe does not want to have the Chinese internet governmental control, so we do not want to have the Californian internet only by big platforms in the private sector. We want to have a European internet. So while a lot of people understood what was behind Macron's argument, this was also a source for misunderstanding and for a plea for a European internet, which is senseless. And insofar, I think that the European approach is now takes on board a lot of criticism which came out after Macron's speech and has offered now, you know, more or less a concept which could be of interest for the rest of the world and mainly for the US. And I think this is also, and this will be my second point, this is an interesting new element now. While we had the last 4 years with the Trump administration really a damage of the transatlantic partnership, now on both sides of the Atlantic, it's very clear that we have to renew the transatlantic partnership because this is based on, let's say, the US and Europe are based on common values, even if we have in some areas different interests. And but as von der Leyen has said several times, so Europe will not be back in a position just to be the junior partner of the United States. And I think this will be interesting to see now how the transatlantic partnership in cyberspace is rebuilt. So just 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, when President Biden and Commissioner von der Leyen addressed the Munich Security Conference, there was interesting to see because also President Biden made very clear, yes, we have to write something like a rule book for the digital world, but von der Leyen was very clear that it is the first priority, and here equals have to come together on a table and have to discuss it. So I think this will be interesting because there are some concrete conflicts between Europeans and Americans. So this is the question of platform regulation. So while over in the US, a lot of groups are now think, you know, we have to do something with the platforms. There was this big hearing last summer in the US Congress, and some people have said, okay, we have to introduce, you know, some legal frameworks. But the US has certainly a different understanding or a different idea how this regulation should be executed. The Europeans have now with the Digital Market Act and, you know, already a concrete proposal on the table. And I think this has to be figured out, you know, how this could work together. We have the conflict on GDPR. There are issues like digital taxation, which is still open. You know, the Trump administration did leave the negotiations in the OECD. Biden, you know, signaled that he will come back to the negotiation table, but it's unclear whether the deadline mid-June will be met. And then the Europeans have said, you know, if we do not reach a global arrangement, then we will start with a European digital tax. And this would certainly undermine a stable transatlantic partnership in cyberspace. And there's also the question of digital trade and the proposal which is negotiated in the World Trade Organization, which is linked to a bigger issue, the reform of the World Trade Organization. So there are a lot of things, but you know, this is the transatlantic partnership, which is based on common values. And I think this is important because the elephant in the room here is China. And China over the years has certainly developed an own strategy, an own policy, which is not based on the same values as the transatlantic partnership. So the best values are certainly democracy, respect of human rights, rule of law, division of powers, and all this what we know from the textbooks of democracy. So in China, you have the one-party system, so this is everything is top-down. You have in many documents of the Chinese government now references to the multi-stakeholder system, but it's this multi-stakeholder system under party leadership. So, and this insofar, China has an own strategy. And if you read all the documents which you can get from China, then you see that they have plans already for 2035 to rebuild the global internet governance ecosystem. So the efforts in the ITU to introduce a new internet protocol go really to the basis of the organization of cyberspace. So that means China is a big competitor. At the same time, it's very clear that you cannot ignore a country with 1.3 billion people and the market, and and big players which are have a role on the global scene. It's not only Alibaba and Tencent and WeChat and TikTok and all the others. So, and more will come, as you will see that the technology is first priority in the new 5-year plan of China. So that means what the transatlantic partnership has to do is to develop a double strategy where we, on the one hand, are aware that China is not a friend. So that means we have some conflicts, and in particular in the field of cybersecurity. So we will see probably a lot of complicated challenges. So on the other hand, so we need China as a partner for many, many other things. The strategy of the Trump administration is decoupling the world and to ban everything which has a China background, is in an interdependent world probably senseless. But we have not yet found the right strategy, how to combine in the right way competition with cooperation. So, and what I have seen also, and I'm happy that some of our Russian friends are here, that Russia plays certainly a big role. So it's not a big economic player, even if they have some players, Yandex, Kaspersky, and some others. But in the security field, China is certainly a key player. Russia is certainly a key player. And while there are big differences in interests between China and Russia, so on the other hand, so you have more or less a similar value system. So that means if you have the big picture, then you could say on the one hand, we see the emergence of a transatlantic partnership between EU and the US, and on the other side, we see the emergence of a Trans-Asian partnership of so-called like-minded countries. So like-minded countries on the one hand, like-minded countries on the other hand. So this is China and Russia, and the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, plays a growing role. And the President Xi from China has said, okay, the relations among the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is a new type of international relations. And you see these countries are very active. Iran is a member. And just in January, Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the Iran foreign minister have signed a bilateral treaty on cybersecurity. So that means we see here in a certain confrontation, so that needs will the internet or the cyberspace ahead of us fall apart into two blocks, but then the rest of the world. And so this is my last point, and then I'm also happy to take questions or comments. So while we have really interesting similarity to the situation in the 1950s, when we had on the one hand NATO, on the other hand Warsaw Pact, and then countries like India or African countries, Latin American countries said, no, we do not want to get pulled into this geostrategic battle, and let's start with a non-aligned movement with equidistance to the big players, at this time Soviet Union and the US. So, and what I've seen from discussions in India, but not only in India, but also in Africa, is that this idea, which was very popular in 1955, is now renewed with a digital non-aligned movement. And India has a market with 1.3 billion people. They have kicked out, the Chinese service provider like TikTok and WeChat, but they are also against Facebook and Twitter. And so they have developed, a closer relationship to Africa. The African Union has just adopted this 10-year strategy until the year 2030. So I would not be surprised to see, let's say, a rebuilding of these blocks you know, transatlantic partnership, a trans-Asian partnership, and then something in between, which could be constituted as a digital non-aligned movement. This will depend to a high degree how on the highest level, the cybersecurity battle between China and the US is played out. And I think this is open, but what I got, the signals, what I got from various groups in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks is that I think on both sides, in Beijing and in Washington, they understand that an escalation into a total confrontation is not good for all sides. So the meeting on Thursday, this is 2 days from now in Anchorage, where for the first time the new administration, it's Foreign Minister Blinken and the Security Advisor Sullivan will meet the Politburo Mitglied from the Communist Party in China responsible for foreign affairs and the Chinese foreign minister. So this is an interesting moment where probably the two leaders are sitting on the table and trying to figure out, you know, where we disagree, where do we agree, what we will do, you know, with the problems ahead of us. There was another very positive signal. This was last week when the open-ended working group in the United Nations were suddenly able to agree on a document with 80 paragraphs on cybersecurity issues. You know, since 2015, around cybersecurity on the global level, you had only confrontation. So I myself was in 2 or 3 of these meetings of the open-ended working group, and I never imagined that, you know, China, Russia, and this will agree on something. So, but the Swiss ambassador Laube was able, with very skillful fingers, you know, to manage a consensus. And so, and I was looking in the eyes from Mr. Putzkich, when the Russian cyber ambassador, when he gave his speech, and was really impressed that he said, okay, this is really an interesting news. And so the question is this a start of a new beginning? And then we organize, taking into account the differences and the conflicts we have, how we organize on a political level the cooperation in the years ahead. So we have some milestones ahead of us. This is Business Plus 20 in particular. In 2025, this is only 4 years from now. And while this is mainly played out on the intergovernmental level, the situation is different today than it was 20 years ago. That means governments have to realize today that they cannot manage this alone. And this is, I think, the challenge also for the multi-stakeholder community, and to be more active and to make constructive proposals. I remember the early days of the Business Summit when non-state actors were removed from the conference hall, and then step by step we were allowed to come in because governments realized in the business process that this makes sense to collaborate with non-state actors from civil society, the technical community, and the business. And what I expect is that while now internet governance or cyber and digital issues are on the highest level, the governments of today and tomorrow will understand that they will be unable to manage these problems in traditional diplomacy and behind closed doors negotiations. So they need non-state actors. And I think this is the responsibility of our community to make some concrete contributions. So this was my statement, and sorry for, like always, being too long. And so you gave me 15 minutes and I took 20. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and thank you for this. I mean, this is not a small topic. It's Olivier Crépin-Leblond speaking. It's not a small topic. We're speaking here about first an article that you drafted that is quite a few pages and that touches on a lot of issues that was already hard to digest. But I think the additional points that you have given to us right now, because this is an ongoing activity, there's so much that keeps on going. is also a lot for everyone to digest. And I wonder how our panelists are digesting this. And we're going to now put them to the test, I guess, and see how they feel about this. We'll start with Fiona Alexander. Fiona, welcome. And well, I'm sure you've read the paper and you've seen this. And yeah, I guess you have the floor on what your views are on this whole moving cyberspace that we have at the moment. And you will have to unmute if you wish to be heard, or we'll have to lip read. Otherwise.
No, they dialed me out.
There we go.
Does that work?
Yeah, can you guys hear now?
Now we can hear you, perfect.
Yeah, they dialed me out because my computer line is not that great. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's nice to see everybody, at least online, for folks that I haven't seen in person in quite a long time. I find myself being inside the United States for an entire full year, which, by the way, is the first time in the entire 48 years of my life that I have not left the country. My mother being from the UK, we would always go back at least once a year. So as Olivier said, prior to my time now at American University, I worked for the US government for about 20 years. And while 8 of those were with Larry Strickling, which was awesome, I worked across 4 administrations. So I worked across the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and a couple years of the Trump administration. So sort of the perspective I'll share is from what that world looked like to me then, and if I was still there, what I would be thinking. Obviously, I can't speak for the Biden administration. I don't work for them. And it's unclear at this point still how they're going to handle some of these issues. So just wanted to kind of give that context. I think what I would say in response to Wolfgang's paper and some of the comments he made is the world's the same as it was 20 years ago when I first started doing this. Not much has changed in the sense of the issues being diverse, regions and countries grappling with it differently. The one thing that is different is that it's become a higher profile set of issues in different governments around the world. So I think that would be the biggest change that I would see. Here in Washington, D.C., maybe just to update a little bit on the current state of play. While we have a new administration that's been in office for just under 2 months, so we're still in the first 60 days of the Biden administration. The priorities have clearly been COVID and COVID relief and dealing with the coronavirus. Social equity issues have been critical, and environmental issues have been critical in the first, and economic recovery in terms of our economy because of the impact of COVID. That's what's been driving everything the Biden White House has done thus far. There has not much happened on technology policy in the Biden administration. They've staffed up on cybersecurity in the sense of protecting and having resilient government networks and networks in the United States. But you do not have the announcement of either Senate-confirmed political appointees, people that would go into Larry's old job, or be commissioners at the FCC, or any of our other regulatory agencies. So none of that's happened yet. And in the economic pillar at the State Department, which is where some of these issues would handle, people have not been named yet either. So I think it's still a moving target to say exactly how the Biden administration will go forward on the specifics and this big set of issues that Wolfgang's article lays out. Congress in and of itself is very, very split in terms of how to handle technology issues. It's one of the challenges that we encountered in the Trump administration as well. But I think both Democrats and Republicans are all concerned about technology policy issues, but for very different reasons, which means there's not a lot of harmony here in DC about how to actually address the issues of the day. The one thing that I think that's clear from the Biden administration, both as Joe Biden was running for president and after, since he's been inaugurated, they will very much focus on rebuilding alliances and including the transatlantic one, and re-engaging in multilateral cooperation. So I think those things are going to ground a lot of what they do. The few international things that happened immediately were rejoining the WHO, yes, Tim Wu is not. He's at the White House in the office of our. I can explain the structure of the U.S. government if you guys want later on. So you don't anyway. So the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Climate Accord as a priority and rejoined the WHO as a priority, and have done big things like that. I think it's interesting, very interesting, that the first international trip the Secretary of State along with the Secretary of Defense, took was to go out and meet with what they've called the Quad, which is an alliance of the US, India, Japan, and Australia. What this says to me is that clearly China is still top of mind in the Biden administration. I will say there's very little that unifies people here in Washington, D.C. Concern about China is one of those things. So regardless of political affiliation, regardless of administration, everyone here is concerned about China. So that still continues to drive sort of not just foreign policy, but all aspects of economic policy here in Washington. I predict what you'll see and what we're starting to see as the Biden administration evaluates what the Trump administration did is, was everything the Trump administration did badly, or was it just poorly executed? I will say the Commerce Department, where they put in place some additional sanctions regimes on technology, the Biden administration has actually decided to maintain those. I think they will implement them differently, but they are maintaining some of the previous policies. So I don't think folks should think that there's going to be a wholesale shift on some of these things. I can definitely explain the policy of the U.S. government, given the organization, given I worked there for so long. Anyway, just to sort of close out on this element of it and reacting to what Wolfgang had said a little bit. Again, I think the U.S.-Europe relationship is going to be important. The transatlantic relationship is always important in U.S. foreign policy aspects. I will say it is complicated by the fact that the UK is no longer part of the European Union. That will add an interesting wrinkle in terms of how Washington looks across the Atlantic, for sure, in particular with the Five Eyes coordination it does, and I will speak slower, the Five Eyes coordination and how we work with the rest of the world. So I think that will be interesting to watch. And again, I think the framing of this, the US or Europe versus the world, or Europe and the rest of the world, I think it's an interesting way to frame it, and quite frankly, probably a good one, because I think, the US and Europe, and sort of like-minded countries, have worked together for a long time on technology policy to get to shared outcomes, but it wasn't without its conflict, and it wasn't without breaks along the way. And I don't think people should think because there's a Biden administration that that's going to continue, or that's not going to continue. I think that, every country or every region legislates its values. That's what governments do. And while the US and Europe have a set of shared values for the most part, the prioritization of those values and the execution of those values can be very, very different. And, I'll give you an example. In Europe, privacy is a fundamental human right? And it's very important. Not that privacy is not important in the United States, but the value or the human right, I think that the Americans and people in the U.S. place as the top one is freedom of expression, which in Europe, people are more apt to regulate speech in a way we historically haven't in the U.S. So when you have at the top of your human rights value chain different rights, you're definitely going to, from that, have different perspectives on what to do. I think the other thing that's going to continue to be a challenge with the transatlantic relationship is the historical preferred regulatory approach that happens here in Washington, D.C. It's always ex post regulation. It's almost never ex ante regulation. In Europe, it's almost always ex ante regulation, never ex post, meaning our colleagues in Europe will look at a situation, think of all the things that could happen, both good and bad, try to prescribe a series of rules around that, and then let things happen. Here in the United States, historically, we look at an issue, we see what happens. If bad or weird things happen, we then try to course correct after the fact. I think both approaches have their merits and their drawbacks, but I don't see that changing as a cultural norm. So I definitely see some challenges in that space where there could be some expectations that the United States will go a certain way, and I'm just not sure that's going to happen quite as fast. And I think to Wolfgang's point, the world has changed in the 4 years of the Trump administration, and Europe has become, or at least I should say Europe being the Commission. Europe is not a single country exactly. So Europe being the Commission, being organized and actually wanting to go forward with a single market and a single set of rules is a much more aggressive Europe than I think the United States has dealt with historically. So that will be interesting to watch as well. And the last thing I'll say, I think one of the other challenges that's going to unfold for the transatlantic relationship is that the EU recently concluded an agreement with China, I believe, on trade and economics. And that's definitely going to have an overhang in terms of some of the work that the US is going to want to pursue in terms of its very proactive position on China. So I think in some, for better or worse, I think the concern of China will continue to dominate sort of the perspective here in DC, and that will trickle out to all things. I think the new administration and the leaders in Congress will definitely want to focus on building alliances and re-engaging and working collaboratively more so, as opposed to I guess much less of the America First agenda of the last administration. But it's definitely not smooth sailing. And I would just say that from my perspective for 20 years, I feel like that's how it's always been. Each of the regions has a different set of concerns. Each of the regions looks at the issues in a way that makes sense for them, and then tries to find common ground with sort of like-minded allies, and or if there's a threat that's similar. So maybe I'll close with that. I have to look at the chat. I couldn't keep up, but I can maybe try to answer some of the questions that were in the chat. And maybe just to comment on one, I think, between Bill and Richard. The other thing that's different, I think, between the US regulatory system and the European regulatory system is that in the United States, when we do decide to regulate, Congress will pass a law. The implementation of that regulation will go to the respective regulatory agency. It could be the Federal Trade Commission. It could be the Federal Communications Commission in the technology space. So we have lots of sector-specific regulators. And then those regulators will go through, a year or 2-year rulemaking process with the entities they're going to regulate to clarify the rules. And then once the rules go into force, they're enforced and people do large fines. And quite frankly, I think the FTC enforces more privacy than most regulators around the world. And the European approach has been different on this. I do remember in my NTIA days in several bilateral meetings with the European Union, a European ambassador to Washington telling me, "Oh, you Americans, you're too litigious. We'll work it out as we go." And this was about GDPR because, we had concerns here in the US who wanted everything was going into force. The European Data Protection Board hadn't even been set up yet. We didn't know what it was going to mean. And we wanted all these answers to figure out how to comply because they're all just rule followers here. And our colleagues in Europe was like, "Oh, we'll work it out as we go." And that kind of approach never will happen here culturally. So I think those two are, again, I say this with all the kindness ever. I'm actually British as well. Different approaches, pros and cons to both, which is, they are not the same. So just to kind of point that out there. So maybe I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for this. It's Olivier speaking. And I'm reminded by staff that we do have interpreters. So for everyone, I know it's an exciting topic, but slow the topic down sometimes a little bit. I'm just coming as to what you said, Fiona. One thing that I was surprised you didn't mention were the commercial tensions that one has seen for several years now surrounding, namely the GAFAs. Is this coming into play as well in a different light than with the previous administration?
I think that remains to be seen in this case. So I saw the questions about Tim Wu. Great for Tim for going back into the administration. Those are hard jobs, and I wish him very, very, very well in terms of that approach. Tim's job as special assistant to the president means that he's a voice in an interagency process. And the reality is that there are a lot of different parts of the US government that are involved in setting tech policy from all the different cabinet agencies. And so, it's going to be one of many. And so it's hard to say right now until you see how the rest of that table fills out. Right now, you have Tim Wu announced as special assistant to the president on technology and competition. Presumably, he's going to play in the antitrust area, but you don't know who's going to take other jobs in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. You don't know who is going to be the intellectual property enforcement coordinator inside the White House. You don't know who on the national security staff is going to deal with technology policy. You don't know who's taking any of the jobs at the Commerce Department, from NTIA to the Patent and Trademark Office, to the International Trade Administration, to the National Institute of Standards. You don't know who's going to be the Undersecretary for Economics in the State Department. You don't know how State Department's going to even organize itself on technology policy. And you don't know what's going to happen at the Justice Department on technology policy either. And all of those voices have a say in what the administration actually does. There's never a single person that actually, definitively makes the decision, unless it's the president, that definitively makes the decision and says, here's what we're going to do. So I think it's a to be determined for U.S. policy in this space. I do think appointing Tim Wu sent a certain signal in terms of dealing with monopolies and or competition, but I think that's consistent with the debate that's been happening in Congress about updating U.S. competition law. So we'll see. I think it's to be determined.
Thank you, Fiona. I guess if this was a Netflix series, we would have to watch the next season to find out about all these exciting things. In the meantime, we're going to have next Richard Hill to comment on, I guess, both what Fiona has shared with us and Wolfgang has. Richard is known to have different views, and I hope that he'll be able to share these with us. Richard, welcome.
Oh, thank you, but I'm going to disappoint you because actually I agree with much, not everything, but much of what Wolfgang said and also what Fiona said. Let me frame that a little bit, and then I will try to find some things where I disagree. But basically, I believe in capitalism and competition and the free market. And I oppose mercantilism, which actually is what Adam Smith did too. He was against that. Now, in my view, neoliberalism is just mercantilism. Big companies make the rules and try to stifle the small players. Why does that happen in ICTs? It's not just the internet, it's ICTs in general. It's because there are natural monopolies because of network effects and economies of scale. And again, as Tim Wu has said, we have to fix that. And furthermore, markets don't work if there are externalities or information asymmetries. Both are common in ICTs. A great example is security. We don't know if a device is sufficiently secure, and my lack of security might not be a problem for me, but it might be for you. And finally, we need to consider not just efficiency, but also equity and resilience. Now, COVID is a great example. Global supply chains were extremely efficient, but they had no resilience when COVID hit. So I think we've now seen, especially with COVID, there is a role for governments. And the question is, what is the proper role for governments and how can you prevent them from doing stupid things, which they do a lot of, including during the COVID. So what's this got to do with Wolfgang? Well, I'm just going to quote him because Wolfgang, I really think you've hit the nail on the head with this one. This is in his paper. If there are conflicts between the general public interests and private profit interests, it needs a stronger involvement of parliaments to discuss and find balanced solutions. Absolutely correct. As Olivier said, I and some of my colleagues, in particular Parminder Jeet Singh, have been considered weirdo outliers, but actually we were just saying this a long time ago. And so I would say, Wolfgang and others, welcome to the club. By the way, I have some links to references. I'll post something in the chat later if people want to look up some links. Wolfgang also says to delegate responsibilities for managing hate speech and fake news to private companies is not a sustainable solution. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And it's also important to stress the disastrous effects of the internet on conventional media and democracy. Again, I'll put a link, but it's Cambridge Analytica and that kind of stuff. And again, Wolfgang says another open and critical issue where private and public interests could collide is the future of digital currencies. I won't go into that here, but that's absolutely true. Fully agree with Wolfgang's analysis of the different national approaches, which he outlined before. It's absolutely brilliant. And I mostly agree, but not 100%, when Wolfgang says that in cyberspace, Europe wants to be a norm maker and not a norm taker. Yeah, I don't think they're going to agree, Wolfgang. I think it's a pipe dream, because up to now, they've always basically kowtowed to the US. But let's see what's happened. When I judge a politician, I look at what they do, not at what they say. The new transatlantic relationship based on common values, yes, I think that everything should be based on common interests. If you can find common interests, then you can move forward. Now, the issue with China is that we actually don't have common interests, notably with respect to free speech, but also on how the government runs the markets and so on. Wolfgang covered that very well. The commonality and interest between Europe and the US, as Fiona pointed out, yeah, okay. In the post-war period, of course, it was very strong because of the huge differences with respect to fascism and communism. So there was a natural alliance. But actually, there are quite different values with respect to free speech, the role of governments, the welfare state, the lack of imperial ambitions. Let's not forget, US is still an imperialistic country, and we can't hide ourselves from that. Europe got over that quite some time ago. It was painful, but they did. Fully agree with Wolfgang's analysis of the human rights, but we should never forget that the US is violating everybody's right to privacy, not just through the Google and so on, but actually the government in the guise of fighting terrorism. Fully agree with Wolfgang's analysis of technology, except that having spent quite a lot of time in the ITU, I'm quite confident, I'm sure Fiona would agree with this, nothing's likely to happen in the ITU because they'll never agree on anything, and one or more states can actually prevent things from going forward. The more realistic threat, if any, is that Huawei will just do its own thing and it would be adopted de facto. And there are good examples of that. For those of us who are old timers, you'll remember that in the beginning, the dominant routing protocol on the internet was actually Cisco's proprietary protocol, which then later got adopted by everybody else and standardized. So a dominant provider can actually impose their own standards. The large digital platforms will become the subject of stronger regulation, says Wolfgang. Well, I think that's a soll in German. That's something that you wish for, or at least some people wish for, but it's not necessarily an ist. That is, it's not necessarily something that will happen. And Wolfgang mentioned the WTO and other trade-related negotiations. And actually, if you look at the proposals, you can see them, for example, in the TPP, but they're the same ones. They're not public in the WTO, but they're bandied around and they tend to leak. The point of those agreements is actually to enshrine the status quo, and so to make sure that we will not be able to have greater government intervention and stronger regulation. That's the purpose of these trade agreements. So we have to really watch out for that. And I fully agree that we need a multi-stakeholder approach. I would disagree that what's been used up to now is the best model. It works fine for ICANN. I don't have any problems with ICANN. ICANN is basically working well, but in other areas, this has not worked. And that's my main difference with what Wolfgang said. The multi-stakeholder approach introduced in WSIS in 2005 is and remains the golden path. Well, actually, multi-stakeholder has been around for a long time before that. It works fairly well in win-win situations. It doesn't work in other situations, and it's often resulting in actually greater corporate power and greater abuses. And again, I'm going to post some papers on that effect. And so this is a kind of a quibble, but it's an important quibble, Wolfgang. You wrote in 1988, the World Trade Organization agreed on 1998 agreed on a so-called e-commerce moratorium, which allowed a free flow of data across borders. No, not at all. They agreed a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. They never defined electronic transmissions, so it's not exactly clear what that is. The moratorium probably made sense back then. A lot of developing countries and economists don't think it makes any sense now. Of course, those who gain from it do think it makes sense. And so that's a big battle going on right now in the WTO. But that's about how to tax electronic commerce, whether at the border or inside through a sales tax or something like that. It's completely different from the free flow of data. The free flow of data is Japan's initiative, free flow of data with trust, and that's something else. Europe is undoubtedly a supporter of a non-fragmented internet, says Wolfgang. No, the GDRP is probably the best example of fracturing the internet that we have right now. And Europe does not want free flow of data. They want free flow of data within the limits of the GDPR. According to Van Leyden, China is a systemic rival. Well, you know, a rival is whoever you want it to be. As far as I know, China is not very keen to export their social and economic system, unlike the old communist bloc, which was, those of us who lived the Cold War know that. But China is no longer Marxist or communist in that sense. They're just doing their own thing. Whereas we're still trying to export our values, right? Now we go around telling the world, you have to do this, you have to do that. Fiona, I'm sure you noticed that Biden reinforced U.S. policy on LGBT rights. And so the U.S. is not going to go around and tell everybody in the world, hey, you have to really recognize LGBT rights, and if you don't. Now, I think that's a good idea, but still, you know, we're being imperialistic and trying to impose our views on the other guys. I don't think that they're doing that. It's now up to the Biden administration to reframe U.S. policy for the 2020s. Yes, Fiona discussed that very well. I won't comment on that. And how is Biden going to handle digital trade with China? That's already pretty clear. As Fiona said, it's the same as Trump in substance, but of course in a softer form. So we're going to see the iron hand in the velvet glove. And we don't know what's going to happen in the WTO. Trump was killing the WTO. Biden is, I think, going to try to revive it as an instrument of US imperialism. And I think Biden, the jury's out, as Fiona said, we don't know. But I think that Biden is basically going to go back to the Clinton-Obama policies, which are basically the big tech agenda. And just since I've gone over time, I'm going to, no, actually, yeah, I have gone over time. So I'm going to stop. Otherwise, I'll come back to killer robots because I do want to say something about that, but only if time allows. Thanks.
Richard, if you want, I mean, if it's quick, you can still add.
Okay, so I'll add just real quick on the killer robots. That's something I thought quite a bit about because I know a bit about military technology. It's actually nothing new. Those of you who know military systems, homing anti-aircraft missiles, homing torpedoes, mines, close-in weapon systems are already killer robots. They're autonomous weapon systems. You launch them and then they do their own thing. Now, they've been there for a long time, but they're restricted in space and time. So if the missile doesn't find its target within a certain period of time in a certain space, it'll self-destruct. And I don't think the military are ever going to be comfortable allowing anything else to happen. So I think kind of the fear of these killer machines and killer robots has been overdone, but that's kind of a side issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's Olivier speaking. I do remind everyone, please, we have our poor interpreters are sweating away at the moment at the speed at which we're speaking. We have time, we'll have time for everyone to speak. Next is going to be Lucien Castex, and Lucien being based in France, that's where where I guess the speech that I mentioned from President Macron at the IGF in Paris was the first time a global, a world president, so a leader of a country actually spoke live and came to an IGF. But things have moved on since then, seeing both the Kleinwächter paper that has brought us together here and also what we've heard from Fiona and from Richard. What's your perspective, Lucien?
Thank you, Olivier, for giving me the floor. Lucien Castex speaking for the record. Good morning and good evening, everyone. I would like first to say that it's excellent to have interpretation to make the debate on internet governance more inclusive. And well, I quite agree with Wolfgang first on saying that it's mostly everybody against everybody, or should we say Europe towards an rest of the world digital dialogue. And as you said, Olivier, it's not a smooth sailing indeed. In the digital agenda, US-China tension are quite a good incentive for the European Union to develop its own digital agenda and its capabilities. And we clearly need a major leap of faith in the multi-stakeholder model. The Internet Governance Forum, for example, has brought together governments, civil society, the private sector, the technical community, academia, and so on since Athens in 2006. But there's been a number of discussions. Europe is supporting the model and a human right-based information society, saying that human right is a key aspect, is a key component of EU policy making. And there has been a number of initiatives. You mentioned the Paris Call for Trust and Cybersecurity in cyberspace, which was announced by Emmanuel Macron during the IGF in Paris in 2018. Since then, the Christchurch Call, for example, to address the issues of terrorism and violent extremism, the Gift City, etc. There's an enormous number of initiatives, as Wolfgang pointed out in his article. And basically, back to Europe, EU member states are quite keen to preserve an open market while protecting at the same time the interests of the citizens. And I would say that the European model is increasingly attractive to the Californian internet and obviously to the Chinese internet also. And the GDPR was the first cornerstone of the EU digital agenda. As it was mentioned, data protection is a fundamental right in the European Union, And today we are discussing the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which are key part of the European digital strategy in the aim of strengthening the single market and basically regulating big online platforms and gatekeepers. The idea is basically to update an old legal framework, which is quite aged now, clearly, and to make a new backbone of EU internet regulation. And yeah, I agree, Europe is trying to set international standards for the digital economy. New rule for gatekeepers to allow new entrants, open innovation, to strengthen consumer choice, and so on. But there is a number of problems to tackle. For example, the reappearance of illegal content, goods and services, the privatization on enforcement, for example, by online platform and so on, and a number of regulation at the European level, at the national level. Well, I've tried to tackle it. For example, obviously, in Europe, the DSA and the DMA I just mentioned, the German NetzDG regulation, in France, the French Avia bill on countering hate speech online, and today the French Senate was examining the global security bill, which is raising a number of concerns also, and the bill comforting, I'll try to translate it in English, but it's a bill comforting the respect of the principle of the Republic, which is currently being discussed in Parliament and in the Senate today. Basically, the bill is in response to the murder of secondary school teacher Samuel Paty and is intended to strengthen the French legal framework and act against those who undermine the French Republic values, basically. And there is a number of provisions on combating the spread of hate speech online and illegal content. My second point, clearly, Wolfgang's article laid out key topics being discussed and the pivotal role of the multi-stakeholder model. But clearly, we need to create concrete outcomes and to strengthen its conceptual basis, develop action-oriented programs. The UN Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Cooperation proposes to step up a bit the architecture for digital cooperation and to build an IGF Plus model, including obviously a multi-stakeholder high-level body, and the debate is ongoing. I also agree with Wolfgang and Richard. Stronger involvement of Parliament is essential. At the IGF level, a parliamentarian tract was put forward in Berlin in 2019, and over 100 MPs came to Berlin. They had a dedicated main session, and clearly this was strengthening the parliamentary dialogue from a number of countries, over 50, if my memory serves me well. But to date, members of parliament are not a specific stakeholder group per se. Usually they are seen as government, but executive and legislative branches of government are quite different in nature. Making the law, it does creating regulatory framework is quite different from the executive branch, obviously. And it's essential for the IGF and for other multi-stakeholder fora to involve Parliament, because basically it's a link to policy making. It's going beyond discussions and best practices to the making of the law, and helping the legislator grasp the knowledge and discussion of the IGF and other fora is essential. Last year, in 2020, obviously, well, the COVID crisis, and IGF, a virtual IGF, but we had a parliamentarian round table. And one of the recommendations was to create an informal parliamentarian working group to further parliamentarian involvement in the process, and it's ongoing. And in Katowice this year, well, it will foster the integration of parliamentarian also. So in 2021, and checking the time also to stay in the bundle, but clearly exchanges between parliamentarian and other stakeholders group, in my opinion, is quite essential to allow for a better understanding and to feed the different national debates. I would say also that the strengthening of national and regional initiatives, for example, IGF France, IGF UK, and so on, it's key to bridging the gap between local and global discussion, and obviously to involve also a member of parliament at the national level and create awareness and sharing of good practices. So to conclude, clearly, we have some milestone and a lot of work ahead of us.
Thank you very much for this, Lucien. And that pretty much rounds off all of our panelist feedback. I was just going to go quickly to Wolfgang briefly to get any points that he wished to respond to, and then we'll open the floor. And there's already a queue there. The chat is already having its own life, should we say, with some excellent discussions going on there as well. So I think taking questions, I see most of the people who have written in the chat are also putting their hands up. So we'll go over to the queue. But first, Wolfgang Kleinwächter, you've heard quite a few things being said after your paper. What are your points on that? Anything that stood out?
Three very brief comments. The first thing is the multi-stakeholder model is certainly an achievement. And as Richard has said, in win-win situation it works, in other situations it doesn't work. But one of the weaknesses of the multi-stakeholder model is that we have not further developed the concept as such. So that means we have the definition from Tunis, we have some principles from the Net Mondial Declaration, but I think this is a challenge also for this community to invest more to make this good idea into a workable concept for all the issues which are ahead of us. The second issue is the, and I'm very thankful for the Lucien when he said this is the hour also of cyber diplomacy with the UN roadmap on digital cooperation. While we see this growing battle among the various big blocs, so the United Nations role has changed over the years. So 15 years ago, there was a fear that the United Nations will take over the internet. And I think Guterres has made very clear that he offers the United Nations an intergovernmental body for a multi-stakeholder dialogue. This is a great invitation. And insofar, you know, and this relates also to the IGF Plus and to the debate about the multi-stakeholder high-level body and so on. But what we have to do is really make quick decisions. That means if you continue a discussion of 5 years, then the whole IGF and the whole business process has also a chance to die. So it's up to this community to move this forward and to bring results. Not only results from the IGF, but you know, framing and building the IGF Plus. And the very last comment is to the role of ICANN. This wasn't discussed, but it was my last point, but I had no time anymore. I think what ICANN now under EURALO does in this growing complexity of cyber battles and all this is very wise. He tries to remain out of the line of fire. ICANN was in the line of fire for many, many years. So it was really the battle about ICANN. So if I remember the war, and we should remember this between ITU and ICANN when Hamoud Touré came to Cairo and said, why your governments are sitting here, you have nothing to say, come to the ITU and we will overtake the whole process. So this is gone, fortunately. So, but there is certainly a risk that you know, ICANN is pulled back, and when Joran introduced this terminology, technical internet governance, I think this was a wise move. It is not new, so it's part of the definition from the business agenda. We'll remember this. So, but at this moment, he has realized, in particular in the post-pandemic situation, that everybody, including the enemies, need a functioning internet. They need a functioning domain name system. And while there are attacks against the domain name system, there are DNS abuse and other things. So at the moment, I do not see anybody who wants to really attack the integrity of the basic public core of the internet. And, you know, to maneuver ICANN, which is a very complex body, out of this political battles, is a value in itself. And I think because EURALO is part of ICANN, and we should be aware of this and not to mix things and to pull ICANN back into the line of fire. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Olivier Crépin-Leblond speaking. And now we're going to open the queue up, and if depending on what channel you're on, you can ask your questions or make your comments in English, in Spanish, in French, or in Russian. I thought I'd mention this because sometimes people on the language channels don't know that the interpretation, the magic of interpretation goes both ways. So you can also intervene there. Now, let's have a look in the queue. And first in the queue, we have Anna Litvinenko. Welcome, Anna, and you have the floor.
Hello.
And sorry for having made you wait for so long, but now we've got the big dialogue, and we'll see if we might be able to extend some of the call here, because I see there's only about 15 minutes. So we'll see if we can extend this to a little more than that. Anna, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much, and thank you for the great talks. I'm Anna Litvinenko from Berlin, Free University of Berlin, and I'm interested in the concept of digital sovereignty, and I would like to maybe hear Wolfgang's opinion, or maybe the other speakers also in the future of this concept, because actually several years ago, digital sovereignty used to be rather negatively connotated, like it was like about internet isolation. It was rather China or Russia who were doing these policies. And right now we see that European Union and Germany in particular are already also using this concept of digital sovereignty. What is your position on that, on like using this term? How do you maybe conceptualize it yourself, and what is the future of digital sovereignty, internet sovereignty? Thank you.
Wolfgang, did you wish to? Fiona Alexander.
Is Wolfgang going to go first? Does he want to go?
Yeah, I make it very brief. So I'm not happy with the digital sovereignty language. I would prefer digital self-determination, because sovereignty is more to the state and can have a special interpretation and would be also used to justify protectionism and censorship, while the right to self-determination, which is also one of the 7 basic use Copen's principles of the Charter of the United Nations, is closer to the people and the individual. So that means if you refer to digital sovereignty, then as one of the 7 principles of the Charter of the United Nations, which were reaffirmed in the report of the open-ended working group, and then go to the principle of digital self-determination as the overriding principles. So that's my comment. Back to you.
Fiona?
Yeah, so can you hear me? That's okay? Yeah, okay. So I think to answer the question, I think the term and the phrase digital sovereignty sort of appeared in the debates, and it definitely came from countries who were looking much more to have the nation state be the decision maker in terms of how things worked. So China or Russia, you know, countries that have that perspective. It seems to me that European countries have adopted the term and tried to interpret it differently, to say, no, it's not about the nation state being the decision maker, it's about the individual citizen, and it's about human rights being at the core of the internet. So this is much more about you know, the European value system, and saying that's actually at the core of the internet. The United States has not adopted the term digital sovereignty, and I don't ever think it would. But again, I think that's the difference between the US and Europe in terms of, and I think Richard actually said it well, which was allowing, I'm going to paraphrase and get exactly what he said wrong, but sort of allowing free flow, but within the confines of what Europe thinks is acceptable. It's a much more prescribed, regulated world, not as, and this is probably wrong, not as regulated and nation state driven as a more authoritarian regime, but definitely different from the European version. And maybe that IGF speech you're talking about from the French president that Lucien was involved in writing was very much, the California internet, the European internet, the giant internet, and maybe that is sort of how I would see the term digital sovereignty. But it definitely has been co-opted by colleagues in Europe to mean putting human rights at the core, and that is not at all what it means when other people use the term. So.
Thank you, Fiona. And I note that I can see the other panelist, Richard. I can't see you, so if you wish to intervene, just say your name, and then I'll call on you if you wish to respond on two things. Let's continue. I can see more discussions on the chat. Let's have the next person in the queue, and that's the, for once, it's the real Andrei Kolesnikov, as opposed to the one that isn't. Andrei, welcome.
Hello, everybody. It's very nice to see a lot of old friends here in the chat on the Zoom.
The camera has just turned itself off. Is that normal? Is that the,
I don't know what's happening, but oh yeah, it's okay. I'm from mobile, so I'll speak. And Wolfgang is always great. I mean, he's like an old French cognac. He's just getting better through the years. However, the Lenin said in 1912, I believe, regarding the Herzen supporters, how deadly far are they from the regular people? 90% of troubled politics around cyberspace is completely virtual. It's detached from the real offline life. We always talk around cooperation based on shared values. Well, first, values are not being shared. To bold it, values of politicians between continents are not the same, of course. We can see it clearly. But if we look from the much virtual Twitter-style politics to the core nations, you'll also find that traditional values are in contradiction with modern values. And this relates not only to tensions between countries, but between people within a single nation. For example, USA recently, right? We saw it. And if we move into the cyberspace, much of the conflicts are virtual. They're not touching the regular people life. I mean, most of the people, the regular users, they don't pay much attention to the tensions in the virtual world around the cybersecurity, etc. But what is troubling, what is really troubling regular users is the level of fraud and financial loss, and also, some kind of digital divide. Also, it impacts people. And second, of course, it's privacy and exploitation of digital platforms, which became giants and caused a lot of attention from the regulators all around the world, especially in Russia. We had this conflict with Twitter a couple of days ago. It was slowed down technically. And also, I should say that we have some news from Russia. I'll do it very generic. Yes, we are going to be digital by 12:30, I believe. 100% of households will have like 1 gigabit link everywhere. And this has the highest priority in the local politics. And it's pretty much internal. It's not, it's technically is a single internet, but internally it's mostly focused, the investments focused on the local people and the local platforms and the local digital platforms. And the last what I would like to say that we may miss around this digital sovereignty. I always have a trouble spelling it. Sovereignty, right? There is a new European Union initiative with focus on sovereign data, but it's not related to the state data. They are talking about the rights of the ownership and protection of the rights of the data sources, data generators, and data holders. This is mostly related to the industrial applications, not to the people, not the human internet, which we're talking about right now. So the next big step will be in the machinery, in the manufacturing, in the digital world, where things talking to the things, and medical objects talking to the digital platforms, etc., etc. So this digital sovereignty is, as US, a UN initiative, is talking about the mostly of the machine data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I keep on thinking you're not a machine, but you're very much involved in the Internet of Things as such. Any response or any thoughts from our panelists, or should we just continue? I'm not seeing anybody. Okay, let's then move on. Let's have the next person in the queue, and that's Pierre Hamalion.
Hello, hi everybody. I put my information in the chat if you don't understand, because I'm not comfortable with the English. Quick hearing, quick English, I'm sorry. I just want to give a way for the internet, which is maybe a mystic way, I think. Everybody can understand that Earth and the world and humanity is probably at a special level now, which is a finite world. You can understand. It's not caused by COVID. COVID is special events like asteroids or at times of T-Rex, remember? But the climate change, the pollutions, plastics, loss of biodiversity, and the main questions are here now. You can't understand that. And in Europe, we are very sensible to that with other nations in the world. In US, I know also, even if on climate, we have seen with Mr. Trump, the question of truth is a big question on this internet. So I think we must go to 3.0 level, which will not be, I'm sorry, it cannot be the Internet of Things, semantic internet. I think it's for probably, I'm sorry to say that, but a Masonic and a divine axis level. I mean, 3.0 is a third level after the one level, 1.0 was monodirection way of human to a machine. The 2.0 is a man to man or man to woman exchange and with a group. So the 2.0 is a social networks level. And at fourth, we go to a noosphere level. Noosphere is the concept of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, which is a Greek Jesuit, which inspired Pope Francis about the integral ecological encyclic. The noosphere level is a global consensus level of humanity on the world. And internet is at force a global machine. It's not a partition of truth. I mean, the truth, how many truths in the world? For the climate, is the truth is that of Putin, Mr. Putin with Arctic interests? Is that of Mr. Trump or Bolsonaro with no, when Mr. Trump say to California governor, the climate, no. Scientists don't know anything. I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, the GIEC group, the consensus of scientifics is a 2 kilogram by square meters of radiative effects on the planet, which is about 50 more than our thermic emissions, human thermic emission, 50 more. So the question of internet now is truth. How many truth in the world? I think we must go urgently to a not materialistic way, but a spiritual way, axis. And that's why I deposit on the ISOC forum in English and French, the Web 3.0 Internet roadmap. And the second level is, for example, the tetrahedric, the 4.0, this occupation, resonate occupation of space for the Earth and the humanity on Earth. We go after levels 5, which is fine arts, sacred arts, divine image, and probably the 6th level, which is heaven, paradise. And on the OSI, you remember the OSI model? I write it on Wikipedia, French Wikipedia. It was reverted in English. I'm sorry. I don't know who made that. But with a symmetric internet and the OSI model, we can retrieve the universal OSI model at seven level. And the 7th level is human application. I think it's a firewall level, and we must stay at the number 6 level, which is paradise even. And the 7 is firewall, and the 8 is probably infinite intergalactic transport in the space. And the 9, of course, in a universal numerology, is the 9 is a finite, is a divine level. Perfection is a creative principle, I think so. So, well, everything is deposit. We need RFC. I have no time to make that. I call for help. But voilà, I wanted to push this way for a 3.0 level, which is, of course, nothing else than spirit, people, men and women, please.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And this sounds like quite a lot of work ahead. I was thinking of starting with the internet and further than that. I'm a little concerned of the time, but I'm told that we will have an extension. So next in the queue is Bill Drake. Unless anybody, do any of our speakers wish to respond to some of the points that were made by recent speakers, or we can just plow on? Let's get a few more. Let's get Bill Drake, and then we'll continue with if any of you have a response or wanted to intervene. Bill, you have the floor.
Thanks, Olivier. Hi, everyone. I was on the board of EURALO for 8 years, from 2008 to 2015, and we were not this active back then. So it's great to see 65 people in a room having interesting discussions. Things have shaped up pretty nicely, which is great. I just wanted to go back to Wolfgang's comments, which I thought, as always, were quite provocative. And he said a couple of things about the EU being a potential model that could be of interest to the world. And I've heard a lot of that from colleagues at meetings here, a lot of talk about the EU as a normative superpower and so on. And often the argument takes off from the GDPR. So I just want to ask Wolfgang a question about the globalization of the GDPR and its implications for the open global internet. So in November, as you probably know, the European Data Protection Board released 2 draft documents about what data will be allowed to flow out of Europe under what circumstances around the world, not just in the US. Everybody seems to always think that this is just an issue between the US and Europe, but data flows from Europe to China to India to Africa to Latin America to everywhere. And a lot of people look at those documents and think that they seem to be leaning in the direction of moving towards stronger data localization requirements. And it's notable that the EU approach in the WTO negotiations that Richard mentioned, the Joint Service Initiative, is quite at variance with the approach taken by most of the other OECD countries on data localization. So I was just wondering, given the difficulty of getting adequacy findings that Europe has always experienced, has already experienced with just a handful of countries qualifying. And the problems that this is raising for global, not just business, but all kinds of things, including cooperation in COVID and so on. If the European model is replicated around the world, there have been many, many countries that have adopted GDPR-inspired policies, but the adequacy finding component of it has not really been rolled out very widely with strong teeth very far. But if that begins to happen, if many countries are requiring adequacy findings before data is allowed to cross national frontiers, I'd be curious to hear from Wolfgang what he thinks that could mean for the global internet and for Europe's role as a norm leader, norm maker in the global internet governance space. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bill, for this. Any response or reaction from our panelists?
It was a question to Wolfgang.
Oh, so Wolfgang is, well, I can't see Wolfgang. That's why I'm asking. Ah, Wolfgang is back. Okay. Wolfgang.
Good question, Bill.
You had disappeared.
Difficult to answer because the 2021 is the first year in the European Digital Decade, which goes until 2030. And it's certainly right, and I think somebody has said this, Europe is now talking the talk, but not yet walking the walk. So that means if there is no substance behind this, then all the good plans which are now tabled with all the various acts and the GDPR is just one element in the bigger package, probably will disappear. So it's really partly a battle. And when you say, what does it mean for the free flow of the internet? So I think in our definition, and you were the main author of the definition in 2005, we made this differentiation between the development and the use of the internet. And so while the development of the internet means, the infrastructure, which is, as I said in my last remarks, fortunately continues to function even in different times. If it comes to the use of the internet, we see indeed this fragmentation, and national interests will take parts of it out. It started 10 years ago with the Russian proposal in the WICIT meeting with the national internet segment, and it has continued. And here I'm more pessimistic that every country, as soon as have identified data as a resource, which is important for the digital economy, they will do what they always did with national resources, oil, coal, or whatsoever. They won't try to control it. So it's difficult with data because, data doesn't disappear when it is used, so it can be reviewed. It's difficult to localize it, but this is a challenge. This is a battle. And to be frank, I cannot answer your concrete question. I just can say it's a long way to go, and we will have some battles ahead of us. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang. I'm not seeing any of our other panelists wishing to add to this. Let's go to the next person in the queue, and that's Matthias Hudobnik. Welcome, Matthias.
Hello, everybody. Matthias Hudobnik is speaking for the record. I hope you can hear me and see me. Great.
Perfectly well, yes.
I'm just on my phone as well, same as Andre. So I can just repeat what others have said. Thank you for the very interesting keynote, Wolfgang. As always, a great pleasure to hear your thoughts, but also a big thank you for the fruitful comments of the panelists. My question comes more from a practical perspective / recent developments in cyberspace. No day passes where we hear in the news about major cyber attacks. And my question would be, what does Wolfgang and the panel or the panelists think? How are the recent cyber attacks? Just to name two: the SolarWinds hack, and for example, the Microsoft Exchange hack some days ago, which both of them seems to have roots to China, are influencing the way rules or regulations in various fora will be developed, and also how states or countries will work together in future. Because furthermore, it can be eliminated that these attacks are state interested. And just to give you a bit of a practical background, the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I'm sure most of you know him, Chris Krebs, who was responsible for the securing of the past US elections and got fired by Trump via tweet, raised big concerns regarding these attacks because they were broadly hitting inter alia institutions in the US on a large scale. And he also mentioned it is time to proactively tackle these issues and hit back as a state. And yeah, I would be curious to hear what Wolfgang and the panelists think on these recent developments and their impacts, if they want. Thank you.
Wolfgang.
Yeah, it's a very critical moment because on the one hand, there is no international treaty which stops cyber espionage. So that means if a country tries to get something out from another country, so it does not breach international law. So, but a spy tries to get the information and does not manipulate the information. But what we see with cyber attacks is that it does not stop just to get access to the data, but it has also the potential to manipulate and to work with the data. And this opens a box of Pandora, because then the question is, if you attack, if this is seen as an attack, then is this in the spirit or does it meet the criteria of Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations? So as a use or threat of force. So, and so there are a number of legal scholars who say, yeah, certainly, you know, this is a threat or use of force against another country. If this is legally clear, then you end up with Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, the right of self-defense. So, and then you have really something like a cyber war. And here it's also unclear whether then the right of self-defense is reduced to the hack back, or whether you can use also complementary means. For instance, you know, in cyber attack from the Gaza Strip against Israel, you know, the Israelis identified the building where the hacker was sitting in and bombarded the buildings. They made phone calls to the people around the building and say, you know, in 10 minutes, the building will be bombarded. Please leave. We do not want to have civilian casualties, but here we have the hacker and we bombard the building. So I think this can lead to an escalation. And furthermore, if the SolarWinds attack is seen as an use of force against the United States, then, you know, the NATO treaty, Article 5, could be mobilized. So that means an attack against one country in NATO context is an attack against other countries, against all NATO members. So this is really very slippery territory, and this needs very careful diplomacy. So Stoltenberg, as the Secretary General of NATO, made always clear, so we are not interested to define red lines, you know, that we, you know, keep a certain flexibility in the interpretation. So, but one thing is for sure, that we do not yet have a price list for attacks. So that means what is going on now, one country attacks another country, but no consequences. So I think this is really on the table now. It was touched a little bit by the open-ended working group report, but this is the next step. I think we have to develop a price list. If something is happening, then you have to calculate with this as an answer. So we have this in other areas of war and peace. And but that's really a very delicate question, and we are maneuvering in very slippery territory. Back to you. And I see Fiona want to comment as well.
Fiona Alexander. I think the phone has dropped. The phone line should be working. Fiona, sorry. It seems that when you speak, it doesn't come through.
One moment, Olivier. All right, Fiona, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, okay, does that work? Yeah, so maybe just to offer this perspective when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber warfare, or whatever you want to call it. And the perspective of the US has been across administrations and looks like it will continue to be based on the statement that came out last week with the open-ended working group, that the US has always believed that if something is a crime offline, it's a crime online, and all those existing norms and rules apply, which is why the US has historically pushed for cyber norms, not necessarily a new cyber treaty. And I don't see that necessarily changing going forward, but I would just offer that as sort of speculative in terms of a response to what Wolfgang was saying.
Thank you, Fiona. It's Olivier speaking. That's interesting. I was actually about to touch on that and ask Wolfgang, why has there not been a treaty of cyber non-aggression treaty or anti-cyber warfare treaty or something to that extent? So the US position is if it's cyber, it's covered by real world already. Interesting. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other panelists wishing to add to this. Let's go to the last person in the queue, last but not least, Yek Yang Chin. And I hope I pronounced the name correctly.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. We can hear you and we can see you too. Welcome.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I think I have two questions. The first question is related to the UN's open working group's role and the IGF pass. So my question is that, do you think they're competing with each other in terms of power? Because as far as I understand, a lot of my colleagues, basically I'm doing internet in China. So my colleague, I'm from China IGF, basically I'm the MSG from China IGF. So my impression is that my colleague pay more attention to the open-ended group rather than the IGF pass or IGF forum. So that because I think that basically they think the opening working group has some real power, even they didn't make any binding treaty as we just discussed. It's non-binding norms. So I'm just wondering, is there a competing of power between these two forums in the future? Because there's a discussion whether they should have one UN mechanism instead of a parallel UN mechanism in terms of internet governance. The second question is about China's role. That's a very dedicated question because actually, as we said, there's a common value between US and Europe in terms of democracy, rule of law, or transparency, or what do we mean by rule of law, But the Chinese have a very different political structure and the culture. So how could they really, if they have to play with the rule underpinned by the European value or the American value, like elective democracy or, or those rule of law or human rights, it's very difficult for them to have a real dialogue or engagement with the European or transatlantic partnership. So what do you think, what kind of role they can play in order to engage? If we continue talking about, there's a static definition of what democracy means, which means free election. I'm sure China cannot meet this criteria in long term, even 20 or 30 years. There are no free election, of course. So what kind of strategy Wolfgang will suggest for China to try to engage with the European or American partners? Thank you. I think that's two questions for me.
Thank you very much, Yek Chin. Over to you, Wolfgang, and then I see Richard Hill as well, who put his hand up. So we'll start with Wolfgang and then Richard.
Thank you, Dick, for your very good questions, and you put your finger exactly on the hot table. I think what we have learned also in previous centuries, I could say we have different cultures, different history on the globe, and people have to learn together and to live together in mutual respect. So that means while I think probably nobody would expect or accept in Europe to accept certain lifestyles or mechanisms which are popular elsewhere in the world, but they live to their national cultures and national experience and history. So one can certainly not expect that the China says, okay, we have to follow the guidelines which are drafted in Washington or Brussels or in Rome by the Pope. So that means that's the reality of the world. We live together on this one planet, and when we have differences, and as long as we discuss these differences in an open and fair way and accept this, that we are different, then I see the opening of windows for cooperation, because there are so many things on the world to do, in particular in cyberspace, which has nothing to do with these basic values. So that means you can work together hand in hand, even if you are not in love together. So I think this is more or less the general guideline, and I hope that the outcome of the meeting on Thursday will give an indication that the two leaders understand this and will be helpful. So that means certainly the differences will continue. I remember the period of communism, you know, when certainly the West Germany was different from East Germany, but we lived together. We had fine ways, and we had a number of cooperation treaties. So, and this was like a competition. So, and but we could survive this without a war. And I think this is important, that you manage these conflicts, you know, without a digital disaster. And to your first question, you know, even the open-ended working group has not much power, even if this is a group of governments. So the IGF and the IGF Plus is a multi-stakeholder body, but both have now a mandate till 2025. So, and I see a lot of potential that the two groups are working hand in hand, both for digital cooperation, which is more the IGF Plus, and for cybersecurity, which is more the open-ended working group. But this is very very interlinked, and so the interesting challenge for both groups is to produce outcome which is reasonable and which will help to stabilize the cyberspace in the interest of all. Back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Richard Hill, you're next. And since we are now really running out of time, this will also serve as closing interventions. Richard.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to come back on the second question that Chichak asked on the human rights. I agree essentially with what Wolfgang said, with just one nuance, Wolfgang. The analogy to East versus West Germany might be more apposite than you think, unfortunately, because the reason there wasn't a war, as you know very well, having lived there, is because there was a wall. And we don't actually want a wall, right? We'd like to have a solution where we don't need a wall. And unfortunately, if you look at the internet, we do have a wall with China, the Great Wall of China. And the US is trying to reinforce that wall by trying to ban TikTok and various other strange things that I think are strange. Some people might think they're perfectly reasonable. Now, that was Trump, and we don't know what Biden's going to do. So let's hope for the best. But I agree with you, Wolfgang. We need to recognize cultural diversity. Things take time. We'd all like to live in a marvelous democratic world, which I think should look like Switzerland. That's not going to happen in my lifetime, but maybe in some future world, or maybe something even better than Switzerland, because Switzerland is not perfect either. We'd also do lots of strange things. Now, for those who don't know the history, the current human rights, they're enshrined in basically two treaties. There are lots of them, but the two main ones are the civil and political rights and the social and economic rights. Those were negotiated right after World War II. Now, we know who won World War II. So that reflects the values of the side that won World War II. And Russia also was one of the winners of World War II. Let's not forget that. And that's reflected in the social and economic rights, whereas the free speech and so on that we always talk about is in the social and political rights and the democracy and so on. In the West, we always put forward that treaty and we don't talk too much about the other one. But the other one is always there, and this all came actually from thinking from Roosevelt, and he recognized 4 rights, one of which was freedom from hunger, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, that is security, and freedom from hunger. So Roosevelt actually was a social democrat, or I'd even say a socialist, recognizing that there are also economic rights, and you can't just let people starve because that's good for the profits of Ford Motor Company or Google, or, you know, take your pick, whoever you want. And by the way, that's what we're seeing with the pandemics. For those who are following the vaccination, why are we not vaccinating fast enough? Because the drug companies have patents, and they're not allowing other places like India to produce at a reasonable price.
Richard,
So,
do you have another hour? Because I think this is taking us to
yeah,
another.
We're going too far, but I just want to say this is a very tricky issue, and we should try to converge on human rights. We did after World War II, but now we're diverging again. And I fully agree with Wolfgang. We've got to try to bring this together. It's hard, but we have to do that.
Fiona, closing words from the other side. I wouldn't say of the lake. It's actually the other side of the pond, the big pond.
So can you hear me? Are you good? So I think maybe it's been a very interesting conversation for the last couple of hours. I've very much enjoyed it. And the only thing that it reconfirms for me is you have to keep having conversations like this to talk things through. Because even, you know, Wolfgang and I are going to agree on some things, but diverge on others. Richard and I are going to agree on things and diverge on others, having had a shared history. Like my first job, I worked on my IT stuff right out of college and worked with Richard a lot. So we have a shared history of what we saw and experienced, but different takeaways from it. And in terms of the US-China dynamic, you know, it's just going to continue. And I think my prediction of what comes out of the conversation in Alaska, which is where they're meeting, I guess, later this week, is a commitment to keep talking. I don't think the administration will not want to look weak on China here domestically. And they still want to evaluate what are the best approaches. I don't think the ban on TikTok made sense either. There were a fair number of things in the Trump administration. While the policy made sense, I think the execution was super flawed. And so I think you'll see a softer, I think as Wolfgang said, an iron-handed and velvet glove approach. But I don't see that changing, but just continuing to talk with China, I think, is what will happen. And again, working with Europe. And I think folks shouldn't assume that the transatlantic relationship is going to be smooth. I think it will be bumpy, both for you know, the difference in what Europe and the US consider as top values, but also, you know, I think Europe is a little bit stunned by what happened here for the last 4 years, and that's going to have to sort of be addressed. But there's definitely like they're different value systems. They're not identical, and I think that will sort of play out as well.
Thank you, Fiona. Lucien, Castex.
Thanks, Olivier. Well, I quite agree with Wolfgang and Richard's. Cybersecurity and digital cooperation are quite intertwined, and we need to work together at IGF Plus or whatever, really. On digital sovereignty, I wanted to just give a closing remark on that. We could question the ability to actually make an informed decision. And I would say that the question is how sovereignty has re-emerged as a key category, as a key topic with regard to digital affairs. And it's mostly the digital transformation and the structure of the internet that seems to actually challenge sovereignty. So it's more like a relation between sovereignty and the digital sector, really. Thank you for the roundtable, Olivier, Sébastien, and all.
Thank you very much, Lucien. Thanks to all of our panelists. And I'm going to hand the floor over to Mate Mester, who is supposed to be, well, having the non-enviable task to summarize everything that's been said in the past 2 hours in less than 4 minutes, I think. Mate, you have the floor.
Okay, Olivier, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well indeed.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I won't be able to conclude and summarize everything in 4 minutes, but I will try my best in doing that. So I think in the beginning, we had a very nice discussion, and Mr. Wolfgang Kleinwächter was speaking about Internet governance outlook in 21. It basically said that not anymore we are speaking about one word and one internet, but there are so many different voices and several efforts to split the internet, and which leads us to troubled water in the next coming years. So this leads us to the notion that more enhanced cooperation and more stabilization is needed, while we are going to face with many challenges, because the stakeholders in this sphere obviously have different values, and in such an environment, a digital disaster should be avoided. He also emphasized that there is a clear change in EU's overall strategy, which is now called the European Digital Decade. And part of this, European leaders invite the world in writing the digital rulebook. And maybe this is perhaps where Europe sees its role in the future, bringing a framework to the cyberspace. And this is a bit different from what Mr. Macron indicated during the IGF in Paris. And because of this, and because of many other reasons, now both sides of the Atlantic are clear that relations should be rebuilt. Because both sides have the same values. However, this is still an interesting process, and there are clear conflicts between the partners in many terms, including the platform regulation, Digital Market Act, Digital Services Act, digital taxation, and GDPR, and so on and so forth. So according to Mr. Kleinwächter, however, the elephant in the room is China, which crafts its strategy on very different values, like rebuilding internet governance by 2035, utilizing the processes within the ITU. And it even complicates the discussion further that all parties rely on each other in many other aspects. Hence, a delicate balance of interest should be found. And in this regard, Russia was also mentioned, that Russia is a like-minded country to China in internet governance matters. An example of this was the Memorandum of Understanding with Iran on cybersecurity. He also mentioned that with India and the African Union on board, this might lead to a similar bloc kind of structure like we've seen in the 1950s. And a similarity, however, is that a full confrontation is again avoided by the parties. And the biggest challenge to that is that the situation needs new approaches from the internet governance community, as the situation could not be managed with traditional diplomatic tools. So in other words, the community should contribute to this discussion. Following that, Ms. Fiona Alexander gave us a very important insight. She also emphasized that while working across many US administrations, but not the current one with Biden, she believes that not much has changed over the last 20 years, but the topics have become higher profile. And I think this is a really interesting point.
Pardon me? Nate, I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is Michelle from staff. Our interpreters are having a hard time interpreting your line. There's an echo. Can you move closer to your microphone, or if you have?
Yeah, I'll try my best. Okay. Or I can change the microphone.
Yes, that would be even better. Thank you.
How about this one? I'm not sure the echo will change, but I will. Let me know if it doesn't work, and I can try to find a solution.
Oh, sorry.
So I think I left the summary where Ms. Fiona Alexander emphasized that so far not much happened on technology policy under the Biden administration, because mostly a political harmony is missing in DC now, how to handle these issues. And however, she also emphasized that the current administration as well sticks to several policies of the Trump administration, which will not make the cooperation easier, and the transatlantic cooperation will also become more complex with the UK not being part of the EU anymore. But she also emphasized that this is not new. It has never been without a conflict, and this is normal. And even though that the parties in the transatlantic are sharing values, prioritization or execution of these problems can be different. So see, for example, the privacy regulation, ex post and ex ante regulation, and so on and so forth. So this is rather normal, and this is just part of the business as usual in global policy making. And in her view, the regulatory approach towards GAFA in response to a question from Olivier is still yet to be seen, as many important roles and administrations have not yet finalized. In the following part, Mr. Richard here added quite many important points, and most of which I'm trying to recall now. It's been quite a lot of interesting points, but he mainly agreed with the prior speakers and mentioned neoliberalism as an important aspect. And he also mentioned that markets don't work with asymmetric information. So that's very important. And that perhaps stronger involvement of parliaments are needed to find a balance. And he also agrees that current fake news management is unsustainable, but Europe perhaps only wishes to set the rules in the digital world, as it might not be strong enough to do that. And he also mentioned that transatlantic cooperation is indeed based on common interests, but that is different from with China. But there are also differences, like the US is violating everybody's rights on privacy. But nothing is likely happen in ITU, as they can never agree on anything. And the dominant provider internet can set its own standards. Whereas he also mentioned that trade agreements are meant to maintain the status quo, and that Europe only wants a free flow of data with the GDPR, which complies with the GDPR. So that's again a restricted policy. And he also mentioned that US and Europe is imperialistic in exporting values, while, for instance, China is not. And in his last remark, he said that military killer robots are not new, and they are restricted in space and time, and the fear around them is a bit overdone. In the next part, Mr. Lucien Castex added that he agreed that currently it is everybody against everybody in this floor or in this playing field, and as well as the EU is against many others. And there is a technological tension between the US and Europe. And he emphasized that multi-stakeholderism is an important in this place, and that IGF processes are key aspect of EU policymaking. So they preserve an open internet and an open market, and protect the interest of the citizens, which is attractive to both Californian and Chinese companies. And the current platform regulation is now making a new backbone for the European framework. And indeed, Europe is trying to set the standards of the technology regulation globally. He came up with a couple of examples of French legislation currently strengthening the rules to protect.
We need to. I am really sorry. It's Sébastien, but we are 32 minutes out of.
I understand.
I am really sorry. You need to stop. I am sorry. Olivier, I will take the floor. I just want to thank you. We will stop the meeting now because we are too late. I hope that next time we will be able to do better with the time, but it was great. Thank you, Olivier. I will give you the floor for the last word. Just wanted to tell you that the next roundtable will be the 20th of April. Please come. I have put all the thanks in the chat. I hope that the interpreter will see it. Olivier, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. I was just going to thank Mate for the great summary. Obviously, so much being said here. We just have to say thank you. Have a very good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are. And thanks to our panelists and to everyone who's been on today's call, and especially to the interpreters as well. 2 hours of constant speak. Have a drink on us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Meeting has been adjourned.
Bye-bye.
Please take care. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.